Hello, fellow Zimbabweans, wherever you are. This is Dr. Manyika, and we're continuing with our discussion on the war on poverty. And I just wait for a few minutes for people to sign on so that we can begin. Trust that you're having a good day and that you are full of hope. And yeah, it's good to see Tirivanu Katikiti, who has just joined. I don't know if you can hear me. Tirivanu, is my audio loud and clear? Can you just indicate for me if my audio is loud and clear before we go further? All right. Sakamuzi has just joined as well. Sakamuzi, could you indicate if the audio, if you can hear me? And Ketiwe, can you let me know if you can hear me before we get started? Oh, good, thank you. All right. All right, we just, Kudzai Martin Mandija, he has just joined. Thank you, Kudzai. It's good to have you. Great, Sultani, and Tatenda. All right. So has become good. Thank you, Ketiwe and Tatenda. Hey, how are you, Tatenda? Thank you for joining. So as I've said over the past couple of weeks, we are actually going to be brief so that we can also enable the people in Zimbabwe to sign on. You know, the cost of data in Zimbabwe is prohibitive for a lot of people. So we're restricting the length of our broadcast to 40 minutes. So we are going to do that so that we can facilitate more and more people hearing our discussion. So thank you for joining. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Prosper. It's good to have you. Thank you, Michael Mutegedza. It's good to have you. So the discussion today is a continuation of the discussion on the war on poverty. But what our focus is going to be today is on why we must pay serious attention to the moves of international players to impact the outcome of our election. Because that has a bearing on our fight to win the war on poverty. Now, so let me begin today by saying, in global politics, it's just as dangerous to be paranoid as it is to be naive. So what paranoid people do is they see enemies where there are nations simply pursuing their self-interest. But naive politicians think every nation that castigates their enemies is their friend. Now, there's a British diplomat, a British peer, Lord Palmerston, who said this a long time ago, and he was correct. He said, in international relations, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And it's really critical for us to understand that where we are right now. So the tragedy of the Look East policy, for instance, was for the government of Robert Mugabe to think that the Chinese who had helped ZANU-PF during the war were permanent friends, instead of a nation with permanent interests. Because you deal with a nation which has permanent interests differently than you deal with, you know, a so-called friend or an enemy. The mistake of the opposition, which once thought Western governments that supported them were permanent friends, is to look at the Chinese as permanent enemies, instead of understanding that both Eastern and Western governments function in their self-interest. So the responsibility to prioritize the interests of the people of Zimbabwe is not, it does not belong to the Chinese, not to the British, but to us, to the Zimbabweans, to the people who will be running the government. They are the ones who are charged with the responsibility of protecting the interests of the Zimbabwean people. So let me say this again, because this is really critical for us to understand. In international relations, you can't be paranoid, neither can you be naive. You have to be alert and vigilant. You have to know who you are representing. You are representing the interests of your people. And you can't expect the Chinese to do that. When the Chinese come in and they are signing deals, they're not thinking about the Zimbabwean people, they're thinking about the Chinese. This is the reason why when they come into the country, they're bringing their own workers, they're bringing their own wheelbarrows, they're bringing their own whatever equipment they need. They're not doing you a favor, as it were. And this whole idea that we sign bilateral agreements and these deals because these people are doing us a favor, is just an indication that we have naive leaders. So it's very dangerous in international relations to be paranoid, just as it is dangerous also to be naive. So there are powerful external forces working in their own self-interest to determine the outcome of our election. We must know that. There are powerful external forces that really want to determine the outcome of our election. So, as you can imagine, the reason why they would like to determine the outcome of our election is to promote their own self-interest. So that shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us that the Chinese want to promote their own self-interest. It shouldn't surprise us that the British want to promote their own self-interest. It shouldn't surprise us that the Americans want to promote their own self-interest. That's what nations do. They do things to promote their own self-interest. So it's critical to understand that. And, there are some things that I'm going to be repeating as we go along, because I really believe that we as citizens need to be equipped with this understanding. And so I'm going to quote Lord Palmerston again, who said, in international relations, there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And only astute people, leaders, understand that. And they can, swing with the punches in a world where everybody is trying to, promote their own self-interest and so on, and they can get they can secure what is in the best interests of their people. So again, there are powerful external forces working in their own self-interest to determine the outcome of our election. They have their own priorities, and if they prevail, this is the challenge. If they prevail, it is not what is in the best interest of the Zimbabwean people that will be prioritized. So what is it that should be in the best interest of the Zimbabwean people? Now, if the majority of our people in this country live in poverty, and that is over 72.5% by Priska Mfumira's admission, and she was, at the time she admitted this last year in July, she was Minister of Public Service and Social Welfare. And she said over 10 million Zimbabweans are living in poverty. So the majority of our people are living in abject poverty and in desperate misery. That's the problem. Obviously that needs to be the priority of any Zimbabwean people, any Zimbabwean government that says it is representing the interests of the people. Now, if that's the situation, if over 10 million of our people are living in abject poverty, then that means that needs to be the number one priority for any government, number one priority. Now, one of the reasons why in the past 6 decades of Africa's post-colonial experience, no African country has made the leap into the ranks of the first world is because mass poverty has been a very effective tool for repression and preserving political power for the ruling elite. So, the ruling elite has never really had an interest in us making that leap from a low-income nation to a first world country, because they benefit from repression, and the ruling elite is a minority. It's not the majority. So they can benefit by throttling everybody else and making sure that they monopolize power and resources, and they make sure that they keep people in poverty in order for them to maintain power. That has been the story in Africa, wherever in almost 100% of African countries. The monopoly of power by the ruling elite and ensuring that the majority of the people live in poverty, and so repression becomes a tool for preserving political power. Now, in a perverse reversal of roles, what has happened is that Africa's liberators have effectively become today's slave masters, while the former colonial masters seemingly become the champions of the rights of the oppressed. And this happens everywhere where you find serious human rights problems, serious inequalities in Africa. The liberators are the ones who are oppressing their people, and the former colonial authorities are the ones who are seemingly the champions of the rights of the oppressed. and that's a troubling development. Now, I say seemingly. Let me tell you why I say seemingly. I say seemingly because they seem to do that only to put pressure on the dictators to bend to their self-interest. And how do we know that? So you see that right now in Zimbabwe, for instance, that it looks like that was the only reason why some of these countries became part of this drive to bring about change in this country. It was to put pressure on Mugabe, and after Mugabe's removal, now on Mnangagwa, simply so he can bend to their own self-interest. And then the second reason why we can never make that leap is because in the last mile of the struggle, those who will have convinced us that they are champions of democracy suddenly seize the opportunity to align their interests with those of the ruling elite. So in the last mile, and this is just before, when you are so excited thinking, yeah, now change is going to come, things start happening, and they start looking for the opportunity to align their interests with whoever they think is going to come in, and they don't care who it is. All of a sudden, they are really not applying the human rights standards or anything like that, and they are making this attempt to whitewash the past of people who these guys are really not champions of democracy at all. All these people who are trying to whitewash ZANU-PF right now know who ZANU-PF is. They know the history of ZANU-PF. They have all the evidence of the stealing. They have all the evidence of the repression and of the participation of some of the people who are in Mnangagwa's government in some heinous things that happened in the history of Zimbabwe. They know it. They absolutely know it. They were very exercised about it actually before November 17. They were saying, these people must go. And we're not just talking about Mugabe, they were talking about everybody. They were talking about the entire system. But in the last mile, of this struggle, they always change. They're always going to find a way to align their interests with the interests of the ruling class or those who they think are going to take power. Now, that is the reason why we don't make that leap as African countries. We don't, because at the last moment, there is something that we always give up. You see, we're allowed freedom on a short leash. We're allowed to go, but not go too far. And that is the thing that we must say no to. We must absolutely refuse that all we can have is this little freedom, and all we can have is this compromised development. So it is very, very critical for us to understand that. So we see that clearly today, and it is the most dangerous thing for the future of our country. That convergence of the interests of a ruling elite that has monopolized power for 38 years with those of former colonial powers. That is really, really the dangerous thing for our country, and something that we really need to fight against. So that convergence was dangerous for Uganda. We talked about this last week and the week before. After the overthrow of Milton Obote in 1971, let me remind you again that the British Foreign Office was delighted by the developments in Uganda. And they noted with delight, that our interest in Uganda in terms of citizens, investment, trade, and aid programs are best served in these circumstances by early recognition of the new government of Idi Amin. And remember the words of the British ambassador to Kampala at the time, Mr. Slater, the British High Commissioner to Kampala. He says, at long last, we have a chance of placing our relations with Uganda on a friendly footing. And he also added that Idi Amin was deeply grateful, as he was, for the promptness with which Her Majesty's government had recognized his regime. Now, the convergence was dangerous for the people of the Central African Republic too. Remember when French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing declared himself a friend and family member of Bokassa, Emperor Bokassa. Not because of the emperor's commitment to democracy and to freedom and equality, no, but because the French got what they wanted, which was uranium. And so think about this. The initial enthusiasm for Amin's rule by the British and the embracing of Bokassa's presidency by the French resulted in the people of Uganda and the Central African Republic enduring 8 and 13 years, respectively, of brutal rule by two of Africa's worst and most cruel dictators. Now, consider also the case of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly known as Zaire, where Western governments propped up a plunderer called Mobutu Sese Seko for 32 years. Those lost years, and this is really what I really want, the point I really want to make tonight. Those lost years have been difficult for the three nations to recover and are largely responsible for the widespread poverty in those nations today. How do you make up for those years? 8 in the case of Uganda, 13 in the case, 32 in the case of Zaire, 13 in the case of the Central African Republic. You know, those are lost years. You can't, it's hard to recover them. So that's why when you look at those nations, they have not made that leap into the ranks of the first world, because there's so much that happens even when people are struggling against oppression, and then they get the support, the seeming support of Western governments and so on, and then the last mile, these people then always show that they're really working in their self-interest. And, you know, it's pointless for you and I to say because they're doing that, they are our enemies. You know, remember what I said at the beginning. It's important to understand that every nation works in its own self-interest. It is our responsibility ourselves to work in the interests of the Zimbabwean people. And it is our responsibility, even those of us right now who are in the opposition, to really watch what's going on and call it out and call it what it is. We must not shortchange the Zimbabwean people. We must pay serious attention to the moves of international players, because their priority is not for us to win the war that we must. And that war is the war on poverty. That is what affects the majority of our people. And we can only make that leap to the ranks of the first world if we make significant progress reducing it. Remember, there is not a single country that has ever made that leap without reducing poverty to below 1/3 of its population. So that needs to be our focus. You know, we need to care what is going on with people in the rural areas. And right now in Zimbabwe, the majority of our people, that's where they are. And, you know, if that doesn't matter, if all we are thinking about is securing deals for business people and so on, we are never going to make that leap. And it affects all of us. Just doesn't affect the people in the rural areas. Ultimately, it catches up with us. Inequality and that extent of poverty, mass poverty, catches up with all of us. You know, I was rather amused the other day by the efforts of those who are availing 100 million to Zimbabwe, that the timing of their announcement does not influence the election, because that money is going to the private sector and not to the government. And you know, clearly this move is meant as an offside trap for members of the opposition, because by opposing it, you would seem to be against the resuscitation of industries and the flowing of money into our economy. So it just puts, you know, people who are in the opposition in a difficult bind. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't really. You must call it out as it is. I mean, it's not going to stop them from bringing the money into the country. The fact that you call it out is not going to stop them from doing. They're going to do it. They've decided to do it, and so on. But you and I know that whenever there is an announcement like the timing of it, there is a reason why it was timed at the time that it was timed. And you know that it is also an effort by those who have decided to align themselves with the interests of the ruling elite in this instance, headed by Mnangagwa. You know, it was meant to really secure, you know, their position and make sure that they would really be considered first in whatever is going to go on in terms of dividing the spoils. And that's something that you and I really need to be concerned about. It's important for us to understand that the ruling elite is not just politicians. It's not just made up of politicians. It's made up of business people as well. And those business people, the truth of the matter is that their primary interest is not that, you know, the lot of the people in the rural areas change. The primary interest of the businessman is, you know, can I do business outside? Can I have foreign currency so I can import stuff and make money? And you and I know that. And in the case of Zimbabwe, where there are so many businesses, legitimate businesses, which have closed, you also know that there's a significant number of businesses that are still operating right now, and they only did so through the patronage of the Zimbabwean government. So, you know, a lot of times, those are the ones that are going to primarily benefit from facilities such as the one that is being availed. So, you know, our responsibility is to call it out. They're not going to stop. They're going to bring that money into the country. And you know what? If it so happens that some of that money goes to legitimate business people and provides employment, thank you. But we must not be naive to think that the timing of this was not meant to actually reward the people who are in power. It was meant to reward, you know, Emmerson Mnangagwa and his administration. And it's really important for us to point that out. Again, it doesn't mean that if it is going to the private sector, it's going to people who will prioritize the war on poverty. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that those who will be recipients of this 100 million are really going to care about what is happening to the woman in the rural areas for whom pregnancy has become a virtual sentence of death because of lack of inadequate health care. That these business people are all of a sudden going to be the champions of basic health care. You know, I don't think so. I haven't seen it, and I really don't believe that is going to happen. They are going to champion the needs of their own enterprises, but not necessarily be talking about, you know, what do we do about the cattle that are dying every day in the rural areas of preventable tick-borne diseases because deep tanks have been shut down. You know, and why is that critical? It is really critical because the asset base of the person who is in the rural areas is really their cattle. And, you know, you may live in the city, you may not understand this, but that's their currency. When they have a cattle, they can dispose of those cattle so that they can pay their children's school fees. They can dispose of the cattle so that in the event that somebody is sick, they can actually pay for health care. They can dispose of that so that they can actually buy food for themselves. So the asset base of the majority of people in Zimbabwe who live in the rural areas is their cattle. And you're not telling me that any of this money is actually even going to go there. It's actually going to be availed to the people who really need it the most. So it is my view, and I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that the most important measure of successful national governance must be a significant reduction of poverty. That must be how people measure their success by. You know, over the years, we have heard ZANU-PF boasting that they have had unparalleled success in meeting national development goals and so on. Well, Priska Mfumira said it. 72.5% of the people live under poverty. 10 million Zimbabweans. That's the majority of our people. That's over 2/3 of our population live in abject poverty when the government is busy actually boasting that they've met national development goals. Now, if the meeting of national development goals is not measured by the reduction in poverty, then how is it measured? You know, it has to be measured by that because that's what counts. That's what affects the majority of our people. It is poverty. That's what affects them. Now, a lot of times when we say that and then we give people a number and we say 72.5% of the people, people just look at it as a statistic. But it's important for you to look at it in terms of these are your relatives. This is your sekuru, your ambuya, your niece, your nephew. These are the people who are failing to pay school fees. These are the people who are actually not able to pay for their own medical care. These are the people who do not have sanitary pads. Young women who go around without sanitary pads. It's important for you to humanize a number so that it makes sense in terms of triggering your passion. We must have a passion for eliminating poverty. That must be our primary passion. That is what must drive national leaders. That's what must drive community leaders. And when we do that, remember again what I said earlier, there is no country which has ever made the leap into the ranks of the first world without significantly reducing poverty. And unless poverty is actually under a third of your population and actually significantly more, then you really can't move into a middle or high income country. And actually that poverty becomes a tax on the majority of the people. And some of you who are out there in the diaspora, that's one of the reasons why you're working 2-3 jobs. The reason why you're working 2-3 jobs is because the majority of our people are poor and they cannot meet their own needs. So you have to meet their needs. And part of the reason, somebody called me the other day and said, we have a very serious psychiatric, mental health situation in the diaspora. And a lot of it is because of people overworking and, really the stress associated with being out there and supporting, people who are at home. It's understandable. That would happen. It would have that kind of impact on the mental health of people. But it's because of this huge tax on all of us, because of this thing called poverty. And unless we, as leaders and as citizens, make sure that this is really our priority, we are in trouble. So what must emerge from this election is a government that will neither be a puppet of the West nor of the East, nor one that is hostile to everyone and measures its strength and the well-being of its people by how loudly it castigates everyone from the podium of the United Nations General Assembly. What we need is a government that has the courage and integrity to advance and protect the interests of the Zimbabwean people above all else. A government that knows that it is more important to protect the asset base of the rural farmer by ensuring that not a single cow is lost to preventable tick-borne diseases because of deep tanks being shut down, than it is to simply reward an international company with a contract to repave an urban street, even when there are local companies that can do it. That's really, really important for us to understand. So again, nothing should terrify the ordinary citizen more than when the interests of a ruling elite that has monopolized power for 38 years, while almost 2/3 of our people live in abject poverty and desperate misery. And so these interests of this ruling elite and those of a former colonial power converge. Lost in the mix is who this struggle is really supposed to benefit. This struggle is supposed to benefit you. It's supposed to benefit your gogo. It's supposed to benefit your relatives in the rural areas. It's supposed to benefit the majority of the Zimbabwean people. So it's really important for us to understand that. So when we see some of these things, when we read in the newspaper, when we see a foreign diplomat, with a scarf around their neck and all of that, we know what's going on. I mean, we must not be naive. That doesn't make them our enemies. It makes them people who are operating on their self-interest. But we need to be alert and we need to be vigilant concerning that. Let me end this portion and then deal with some of your questions before we end the broadcast. Let me end this by saying, it's really interesting when you drive around Harare right now. We're surrounded by these grotesque, these hideous billboards. They are everywhere. And somehow that's supposed to condition us. It's kind of Orwellian, it's supposed to condition us to vote in a certain way, kind of like Pavlov's dogs. We get to the election and automatically, we vote for people who we know are responsible for our misery. And those who would have condemned this before, nations that have long traditions of democracy, who could have said, you look at one of these billboards, which is the Mountain building. How much that billboard costs. And you know what? Normally, before this last mile, Some of these governments would have even pointed it out and said, look, I mean, these people, I mean, how much money are they wasting on this? And so they're not going to do that. It's up to you as a Zimbabwean to see. It's grotesque. You know, these things are really grotesque. These are things that we will really absolutely need to condemn. Don't be fooled. It's time for us to say no to some of the things that are going on and to say it forcefully. But the best time to actually be forceful with saying no is at election time. Elect the people who you know are actually going to change your circumstances. Elect the people that you're going to be able to hold accountable. And I've said this as a reminder to all those, to my fellow Zimbabweans, you don't just have the power to elect, you have the power to recall. And it's important after you elect to really make sure that those people who are going to represent you know that you actually have the power to recall. You can recall them for non-performance. You can recall them for disappearing from your constituency for 2 months and you don't see them. You can exercise the power to recall. And it's really important for those that you choose to understand that. So I want to invite you, if you want to be part of the Build Zimbabwe Alliance, feel free to contact us if you're on our website. If you want to run on our platform, you know, we will talk to you, and we're very, very excited by what's going on and the number of people that we have actually put together. And we are very, very confident of really bringing about change in this country, and we want your vote, we want your support. We also want you to send us even to some of these rural communities. By the way, there are 150 rural communities in Zimbabwe and only 60 urban. And a lot of times, you know, the ones that make the most noise are the urban ones. They're the ones who have a voice. And the voiceless masses of Zimbabwe are in the 150 constituencies. And we are determined to go to every one of those constituencies and make their voices heard. So I look forward to engaging with you some more. I'm going to take your questions now. And at 7:40, we're going to end our broadcast. So let me look at the first question here. Thomas commented and said, these rush deals are opening up our economy to grave new dangers, which will even kill the economy further in the not so distant future. We have become so desperate that we lack foresight of the precise intentions of the so-called developed nations. You're right, absolutely. So it's important for us to really understand that you know, these people who sign deals with us do so in their own self-interest. You know, we absolutely need to understand that. And if we don't understand that, we just go on signing these lopsided deals, and it's not in the interests of our people. Yeah, so you're very right. Yeah, I see Ramai Mash is here again, and she says Pavlov's theory does not apply to election billboards. You know, Ed has the right and the funding to do so. £300,000 was spent on a wedding dress in the United Kingdom. Very good for reminding us that it's okay in a country such as ours for people to actually spend that amount of money. And if it's okay with you, Ramai, you know, you don't think like we do. You know, you really don't. In fact, I hadn't recognized you the last time. You really are a troll, actually. You come so that you can spew all that. If you're a supporter of Ed, what are you doing on our platforms? What are you doing here? Go ahead and support Ed. You did say last time Ed has your vote. Go ahead and vote for Ed. That is your democratic right. And this idea that you know more than anyone, and if somebody uses an analogy like Pavlov's dog, you know they shouldn't use that because it doesn't apply to elections. That shows just how limited your thinking is. So you know, we use the analogies that we want to use, just like your Ed uses the analogies that he uses, and some of them are very unfortunate. He calls people dogs primarily by saying that and so on, and that's what you want. And unfortunately, well, fortunately, that's not what we want. You can want that. You can delight in the oppression and the ridiculing of people by those who you support. We don't. So you have every right as a Zimbabwean, as a free citizen, to support who you want. We have every right to say what we want and to use the analogies that we want to use. Ketai, you say, I have a feeling Us, the people, are the biggest problem in our political spectrum. We seem not to know what we want. We are so loyal to political parties instead of focusing on substance, which are the policies. And that's very, very important. The point that you make is absolutely important. That it's, we need to really consider the substance that people are sharing. It's really, really critical that we do. Because at the end of the day, it's not the excitement about a candidate that really solves our problem. It's what that candidate is going to do and has the capacity to do. We really need to make sure that we hold every candidate's feet to the fire, including the candidates that we ourselves are going to field. Nobody should be excused from that. This is part of the reason why we are doing this. We are doing this to provide the Zimbabwean people with as many alternatives so that they can choose, they can decide who their best is. I don't take it for granted that we are simply going to win the election. Nobody should. That's why this is a campaign. You present your best to the Zimbabwean people and you trust their judgment. And I truly believe that the Zimbabwean people are going to judge well if we present ourselves as an alternative and we go before them. The problem, Ketai, a lot of times is that we don't go before people. We simply focus on the people who are in the urban areas and we neglect the majority of our people. Remember, Zimbabwe has a one-man, one-vote system. And the one vote of the rural person is the same as the one vote of the urban person. So if we don't go to the rural communities and actually present your alternative to the rural communities, you must understand that when they vote, it's not a weighted vote. Whatever vote, it counts as a vote. So neglecting the majority of votes which is in the rural areas and pretending as if it really doesn't impact the outcome. So here we are, we're in the cities, we're just going to fight over these 60 seats. It doesn't really make any sense. So that's one of the reasons why we say to you, send us to these rural communities, get in touch with us and send us to Maboleni, send us to Cholocho, send us to Plumtree, send us to Uzumba Rambafungwe, send us. And you know what I mean when I say send us. The people who are going to fund this election are Zimbabweans themselves. And it's really, really important for us to resource the change that we want. And we're looking forward to being sent by you. Cham asks and he says, are you going to field your BZA candidate the whole country? Are you councillors, MPs, senators? Yes, we are actually on track to do that, but we're also on track to support those candidates that we know we share the same values and who we really believe are going to be the best candidates in certain places. So even though we have built up quite significantly, we have not yet covered the whole country, but we are on target to do that. But one of the ways we're going to do that is also by partnering with those who we know share our values and really making sure that we support them. Because at the end of the day, that's what's important. It's important for us to have the right leaders in Parliament and as councillors. That is really, really important. So, another question from Gerald is, do you think ED is not honest on corruption and should Mukube be fired for his reckless utterances? Yeah, well, he shouldn't just be fired. He has no business even being a deputy minister. I mean, a person who thinks like that, it's really unfortunate. There's no place for people who think that the military should not salute civilian leaders simply because they didn't go to war. Thankfully, I saw a letter that was written by the acting Minister of Information today, repudiating those remarks, and they should be repudiated and repudiated strongly. Those remarks and what Webster Shamu supposedly did is the same. And yeah, in my view, such people should be fired and fired immediately. We don't need that at all in Zimbabwe. And it's unfortunate also that it comes from a person who is young, and I heard him demeaning himself, saying, even me, I couldn't even think of being a president. Why wouldn't you think, why would you disqualify yourself because of your age? Because if it was age, then Mugabe would, be a brilliant leader, right? The leader that we really want. So, that kind of bootlicking, we've seen it, the bootlicking, and we've had some call Mai Mnangagwa Jesus and all of that. There's no place in Zimbabwe, and it should be condemned by everybody. there seems to be a conspiracy in the media. Colin says, both private and public, to thwart your voice and sort of ignore you. Actually, how are you going to counter this media blackout as a presidential candidate and as a party? Surely candidate is articulate as you cannot just be ignored. You know what, Colin? You know, to be honest with you, people will do whatever they will to disadvantage you. That is how they have always played the game. But in my own view, the most important thing is for us to connect with people like you. You connecting us with others in your circle is much more important. You know, this media, the kind of expectation that these people who have always done this over these past 38 years are going to be fair to us. That kind of, I really don't have that expectation. I believe that the voice of people who are courageous and who speak the truth will ultimately be heard. It might be ignored at first, but you know what? Sometimes even being ignored is an incredible opportunity, because then you connect with those people who have sense, and you're able to actually build an army that represents you well. And at the end of the day, I truly believe that when we do that and we're engaging people at community level and all of that, we are going to get so much mileage from it, because the Zimbabwean people know their own pain. We have had incredible success in the constituencies where we have candidates, because we have that approach. We're not waiting for the press to talk about us. We're going door to door. We're talking to people on a one-on-one basis, and I can assure you that some people are going to be surprised, when election time comes. I'm going to answer one more question before I leave. I thank you so much for all your comments. I saw a question here. If people in the diaspora come down and see the situation in the rural areas, they will have a change of heart. I think it is important to have an informed opinion. Thank you, Leslie, for that. You are absolutely right. I was saying in another program yesterday that we must challenge ourselves, even when we visit home, to expose ourselves to things that maybe because your relatives live in the cities, you never really go to the rural areas, and maybe because they live in the suburbs, you never even go to places like Budiriro or Magwegwe. You never go to some of these places in the high density suburbs. So you don't know how people live, So it's hard for you to imagine that there are people who haven't had water for 16 years and that they haven't flushed their toilets in those 16 to 20 years. And today in the cities, people are still running into the patch, into the field out there to do their business, in 2018. So it's kind of difficult sometimes for people to imagine that. And it's even much more difficult for people who, don't have connections in the rural areas to understand just what life is like for the person who is in the rural area. So even when we talk about deep tanks and stuff like that, people just don't understand it. I went to a church at one time, and one of the people at that church, we were talking about, I said to this person, I said, do you really love your mother? and they said yes. And I said, but you're educated and everything, and even in 2018, your mother is still squatting in a Blair toilet. How can really that be you loving your mother? That even at this point, 2018, you actually have the wherewithal to put a borehole and to actually put a pump and put a tank on top of your parents' house, and to dig a septic tank just so that life for your mother can be transformed. Now, guys, the majority of our people live that way. And it's important for us to inform ourselves and to educate ourselves. And, it's hard sometimes for you to feel sympathy for somebody that you're not emotionally connected to, but that's leadership. Leadership is actually about putting yourself in situations where you understand the misery of others. And when you've understood that misery, you empathize and you act on that empathy. That's leadership. That's transformational leadership. That's the kind of leadership that we want in Zimbabwe. That's the kind of leadership that we need. You know, I'm honored to offer myself for leadership, and I am truly hoping, you know, and I say this to all those people who say, you know, so you know, how can you get known there and so on? I can get known through you. You are our representatives. You are the one who has heard the message. So now that you have heard the message, take it to the next person, and let's change Zimbabwe. Thank you so much. And as we always do at the end of our broadcasts, you know, we have made a declaration at Build Zimbabwe that Zimbabwe is our country. It is our heritage. Zimbabwe ilizwe letu, ilifa letu. Zimbabwe nyika yedu, naka yedu. And that is the reason why we fight for it. That's the reason why we put ourselves through this process. That is why we are so determined to do what we do, because it's our country. It's mine, it's yours. And, you know, if we do the right thing for our country, great things are going to happen. I'm very, very excited. In fact, I'm really getting pumped up as we get closer and closer to the election, because I truly, truly believe that Zimbabweans are going to do the right thing. Good night, if it's night where you are. Good day wherever you are, and we'll talk to you again next week.